Greetings and welcome back to a deep dive into Matthew's Gospel. I'm Jim Kirby, I'm your host. And I'd like to thank everybody for their comments below. You can add your comments below, your opinions, suggestions, whatever you want to talk about. You can also email me, jkirby1@me.com. One of the changes is our light. Our light is not nearly as red as it once was. It's a little softer and maybe a little bit more pleasing blue. I'm still not happy with the color temperature, but we're working on it. And that's what we do here at a deep dive into Matthew's Gospel. Now, so far we've talked about who Matthew is, who's his audience, what's a gospel, what's the history of the oral tradition, how did the gospel get passed down, all these different things. On this edition of a deep dive into Matthew, we are going to take a deep dive into the destruction of the temple. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what's the big deal? Okay, so the temple got destroyed. No. We cannot totally understand Matthew's gospel unless we really understand what the destruction of the temple means. It's like 911 for the early Jewish people. This was the center of their faith. The Jewish tradition prior to the destruction of the temple was centered on the temple, the Holy of Holies. Now, the Holy of Holies is literally the presence of God. That's what they believe. They go to the temple and only certain people can go into the Holy of Holies at certain times of the year, and that's where God inhabited. And that's why it was so central. The Jewish faith back then was a faith of the temple and the land. And the destruction of the temple in 70 AD took away both of those things. And so the question is, how can we be Jewish people without the temple, without the land? Well, we'll figure that out. But that's the situation that Matthew is writing his gospel in. It's the situation, this transition of the Jewish people from being a temple-centered faith into trying to figure out how they're going to be a Jewish religion after the temple was destroyed. It was never rebuilt again to its form. The Jewish people lost control of the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD and really didn't have much of an input into it until 2,000 years later. And so the tension and the meaning of the destruction of the temple for the Jews and the early Christians was monumental. One of the things that happened after the destruction of the temple was, this is the end of the world. I mean, when the temple's destroyed, this is the end of the world. And both the Jewish people and the Christians, the new Christians, kind of saw it the same way. And another thing that developed was the blame game. Who's responsible for the temple being destroyed? The Jewish people blamed the Christians. Look how you ruined our Jewish faith. Look at all the confusion and the manipulation you guys have done, you Christians, with this idea that Jesus, this guy from Nazareth, was the Messiah. That's horrible. That's sinful. And the Christians did the same thing. Well, you guys are responsible for it. See what happens when you crucify the Messiah? See what happens when you crucify Jesus? You get what you pay for. And the destruction of the temple is one of those things. Now, one of the things that this leads to is you can see the beginnings of the anti-Semitism that's going to start developing later on, hundreds and hundreds of years later, where the Jewish people get blamed for a lot of things. And so you can already see how this is developing. But the destruction of the temple is not like Notre Dame catching on fire in Paris. It's more than that. This is attacking the central part of the Jewish faith. That's what Osama bin Laden wanted to do. He wanted to attack the central part of the American capitalism, free market. What better symbol was there than to destroy the Twin Towers? And that's exactly what the Romans did when they invaded and destroyed the temples, took over the city. The Jewish people really didn't have control over the city until thousands of years later. And so it's understanding that situation is our way to understand Matthew's gospel. Now, the temple prior to 70 AD, the time of Jesus and Matthew, it has a long history. The first temple was built by King Solomon, and it was destroyed in the 5th century BC by King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylonian. You can read about it in 2 Kings. It's all about this first destruction of the temple. In 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 1, "Now in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, camped against it and built a siege wall around it. 2 Kings. Okay, and so this is already a traumatic experience even back then. And so the temple being destroyed and the city of Jerusalem, God's city, being destroyed and sieged upon, no matter who it is, the Babylonians or the Romans, it's a big deal. So in the 5th century BC, the first temple is destroyed, but it wasn't long before the Israelites built it right back up again. Within 50 years, the next phase of the temple was built. Now, it was nowhere near what it was during the time of Herod in 70 AD. The temple took a lot of forms and it was developing all through the years. Herod made this magnificent temple. As crazy as he was with his family and with his friends, he was a great architect, and we'll talk more about Herod as the time goes on. But so the temple's being rebuilt and it's flourishing up until the time of Herod. Herod's rebuilt it. It's this huge, monstrous thing. We have no idea how big this thing was. Several football fields wide. I mean, this thing was huge, and we'll talk about it later. But the important thing is that even when it was destroyed in the 5th century BC, it was so important that it kept developing and being rebuilt even up until the time of 70 AD when it was destroyed by the Romans. So the destruction of the temple did not just affect the Jewish people, it also affected the early Christians, because they were Jewish converts and they were still trying to figure out how to be Christians and how to be Jews at the same time. A lot of the Christians did not see the separation between Judaism and Christianity. A lot of the Jewish people that Matthew was talking about did not want to separate from the Jewish religion. You know, they wanted to embrace Christianity, at least the principles of it, but they didn't see themselves as a different religion. They still went to the synagogue, they still went to the temple. So this destruction of the temple is not just affecting the Jews, it's striking at the heart of these early Christians at the same time. And so there's going to be two different responses: the Jewish response to the destruction of the temple and the Christian response to the destruction of the temple. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people believed, including Matthew and his audience, that this is the end of the world is coming. The world is not going to last very long. And so this is what's called apocalyptic literary devices, apocalyptic views of both Matthew and the Jewish people and the church leaders at the same time. This apocalyptic view of things. The world's coming to an end. The destruction of the temple means these end times are coming. And so apocalyptic is a word that means prophesizing about the world coming to an end. The destruction of the world, the way that the prophets foretold. The world is coming to an end, and the destruction of the temple is a clear sign, at least it was to them, that this is how it's going to happen. This is the beginning of the end of the world. And so both Christian writers, Matthew's Gospel is an example, also prophets like Ezra and Baruch and the Jewish tradition, all these writings about the apocalypse, about the end times, are talking about this destruction of the temple. At least that's what they thought. So the temple kind of laid in ruins, and, you know, various attempts to rebuild it really didn't amount to much. The Jews would really not rule in Jerusalem until 2,000 years later. Here's the main question. How are the Jewish people going to survive? How is this religion that's built on the temple and the land going to survive without either one? Remember, they've just been wiped out by the Romans. How are they going to respond? And so this is all about Matthew's his situation and the milieu of the reactions to this terrible event that is going to affect the way he writes his gospel. The world's coming to an end, many people thought. And so all these different things are going to affect Matthew and the way he writes about it. Prior to AD 70, the destruction of the temple, there were still these emerging groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They developed along with the scribes. The Pharisees were kind of like the Republicans, and the Sadducees are kind of like the Democrats, I guess, and the scribes were kind of like the independents, I guess. I don't know. I'm making it up. Anyways, the Pharisees were much more particular. They were much more involved with the details of people's lives, interpreting, ritual eating, tithing, all the different festivals, all the different, like marriage and things like that. The Pharisees were really dialed in on that. The Sadducees were more theological. They didn't believe in an afterlife. They were kind of a more down to earth, a low Christology theology without the Christology of it. Anyway, so these two different groups, regardless of how I'm butchering their beliefs, there's tension between the Jewish people, the Jewish church, and the scribes as well. And so why do I bring this up? Why do I spend so much time on this development? Well, as these different tensions in the Jewish faith continue to grow, imagine what's going on between Matthew's audience, his Christians, his audience, and how he's dealing with the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. So you can see in even the interaction of Jesus, how these tensions are elevated and how they're more visceral almost. And you can see why that's happening. As Matthew is recalling Jesus' life, he's using his sources, he's putting together Jesus' dialogue, and he's remembering these parables, he's remembering the sayings of Jesus, and he's putting it all together. And so this tension, that even though Matthew is writing after Jesus' time, he's writing about Jesus' time, but you can see how the destruction of the temple and the tension in the Jewish faith moving forward is affecting things for him. There's rivalries that are developing, not just between Christians and Jews, but between the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, etc. So this is the soup in which Matthew's gospel is being written, and I think it's important for us to understand that. So when we read Matthew's gospel and we try to say, well, why is it different than Luke and John and Mark? Well, this is because of all the stuff that Matthew is writing and all these influences on him that he cannot escape. It wouldn't even occur to him to write in a different way. This is how he's seeing it. This is how he's being affected and influenced by his situation and the things that are going on around him. So I hope I have convinced you on the significance of the destruction of the temple and the chaos that took place afterwards, how everything was changing, and Matthew's audience being the Jewish people, how they were thrown into it too. How are they going to survive without the temple? What kind of a religion are they going to have? Even Christians were asking that question. What kind of religion are we having now that the temple's gone? And the Jewish people the same way. How are we going to be a religion without the temple? Well, the Jewish people became a book of the law. And the Christians became even more Christian. They separated even more away from their Jewish roots. And so this destruction pushed the Christians in a different direction, certainly pushed the Jewish people in a different direction. You can see how the similarities between the two began to drift apart. So I hope that's meaningful to you. I think it's important. Now, as I mentioned, some of you may just cringe about going down this rabbit hole, but I want to do a separate episode on the destruction of the temple by the Romans. I think it's fascinating. I think you'll get a better idea of how terrible it was. I keep mentioning 9/11. We on the anniversary, we look back at all the documentaries, all these different things, and how horrible it was. It's the same thing. And by telling that story, I hope I emphasize how big a deal this was. And it's just not this passing thing that, oh yeah, the temple burned down. No, it's more than that. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's important for us to know that as we try to understand Matthew's gospel. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you keep sending your comments and emails, comments below, right down here. You can do that. Email me, jkirby1@me.com. On our next episode, in addition to the one on the destruction of the temple, we're going to talk about a guy named Josephus. He's a historian of the time, okay? And so he's able to corroborate a lot of the things that the gospel writers are talking about. He's a fascinating guy. Interesting story. We're going to talk about him. And then we're going to get into the first chapter of Matthew. It's going to be great. One other thing that we need to remember is the translations. What translation do we pick up when we're reading the Bible, because that has a lot of effect on what we're doing too. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go. It's great. I think this is fun. I hope you're enjoying it. Let me know how you're doing. Let me know what you want to see changed, or for God's sake, stop talking about this, Jim, and I will. I want to make this better and more interactive. So join us again next time on this episode, and we'll keep talking about the deep dive into Matthew's Gospel. Let Matthew be Matthew.